Vamos a comenzar. Let's get started. My name is your phone, and I'll be moderating the event, presenting the speakers and the program. It's such an incredibly huge honor for me to introduce the speakers and the subject of topic of today's discussion. Both Peter and Bill have worked with the Bildner Center in past events on the Cuba project, and we have seen their interest in US-Cuba relations evolve over the years. I think at one point we helped organize an event, right, in May, a few years ago, on the issue of secret negotiation. So in some ways, in a small way, we also helped provide material for this incredibly huge undertaking. Just imagine the accomplishment. I mean, they finished, this book is finished and went to the public to sale in October. And then a few weeks later, as this wonderful account of the evolution of US-Cuba relations over 50 years is published, it's a masterful account of today. Then the US announces an effort of normalize, the US and Cuba, efforts of normalize relations. So one of the things we want to know from the speakers is how they managed to synchronize communication to history, or whether they know something we don't know, or whether they are creating history, maybe, perhaps. And that's one of the issues we want to address. But it's a remarkable coincidence. It's one of the reasons why the book is so widely sought in sold many copies. Again, we are unable to provide copies today, and thus we apologize. It's not possible. They're too bit bulky. So we'll wait for the paperback version.
I wouldn't say that.
I think we will have, my throat is not doing thoroughly well. I just came back from Cuba myself, and I had a couple of events that affected my speech and what have you. In any case, the program includes notations of the speakers. They're both accomplished scholars over many years, decades of publications and various other activities on behalf of serious research on U.S., Latin America, U.S.-Cuba relations. And I urge you to please consult the program. It's really worth to establish the credentials and to realize the magnificent contributions of both speakers. I happen to have known them both, especially Peter, for quite a bit of time. And I know their trajectories, and it's a great honor again to be here with them today. I mean, Peter, you're going to go first, right?
I am.
So shall we go to the background and get started?
Come up there.
Good.
So it's a wonderful pleasure to be here. I've waited many years to come and speak at this center. I've wanted to speak here because of Professor Mauricio Font, who I have known since the late 1970s, when he was getting his PhD at the University of Michigan. And he was, in fact, the first Cuban American I had ever met. I was a teenager going into college when I first met him. He had a radio show on Latin America at the University of Michigan, where I got all my news on Latin America. Really, I'd say that, Mauricio, it all started with you. And here we are. Here we are all these years.
A number of years later.
All these years later, we've lived to see the moment in which U.S.-Cuban relations have started to fundamentally change for the better. And that has been a result of his work, of Professor William LeoGrande's work over all these years, and the work of so many others. Now, Bill LeoGrande and I were actually in Cuba on the day that this all happened, December 17th, 2014, which the Cubans now refer to as 17D. This is the reference that's going to go down in history. And I had to have this picture taken of me so I could prove that I was actually there. while President Castro was giving this speech, simultaneous to President Obama also making this announcement. And we've done a little research, and originally the secret agreement between Cuba and the United States was that President Obama was going to go on television at 12 o'clock, and President Castro was going to go on his television at 1 o'clock. But of course, in the spirit of even Steven, of mutual respect, of reciprocity, the Cubans decided they would do it at exactly the same time, 12 o'clock on the dot. And that's how the announcement played out. The day before, the President of the United States had picked up the telephone and called the President of Cuba. This is the first known telephone conversation between the two presidents since after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. That is the valley, the gap of communications between the highest levels of the leadership in our two countries. And of course, they talked through what was going to happen the next day, the specifics of how the planes were going to be sent to Cuba. I don't know if you know this, but President Obama sent Air Force One, one of the smaller planes as part of the fleet of the presidential aircraft, to Cuba to pick up Alan Gross. Another plane came from the United States with the 3 Cuban agents on it, and Alan Gross. And somehow this CIA asset that had been in Cuba that was also being released somehow came back. I don't know if they came back on the same plane or not. That remains a big secret. And you know, the world changed for U.S.-Cuban relations. And we're talking today here at the exact moment that the follow-up talks, the diplomatic talks, are going on right now in Washington, D.C. And hopefully they went positively, constructively, as the Cubans like to put it. President Obama is the first president to succeed in changing this difficult and almost intractable 50-plus year problem in U.S. policy towards Cuba. But I have to say, he's not the first president to have tried. What we did in the work on our book, Bill LeoGrande and I, was to try and put together all the history of all the presidents who have tried, and the Cuban efforts as well, to arrive at the very moment that we are experiencing today. We set about doing this to answer Mauricio's question about the odd coincidence of when our book came out. We set about doing this 10 years ago, thinking ahead that Barack Obama would be president of the United States, and that we would provide a book that gave him the historical precedents for the predicted policy that he would want to take on Cuba. And I have to pat us both on the back for impeccable timing. The book, I think, luckily is relevant. It came out before the administration made this change, and we've talked to a number of officials since, and it's clear that they looked at it and that it was useful to them. Although, truth be told, they had already were very deep into the final stages of secret talks with Cuba to arrive at this point when the book came out. But there's a lot of precedents for this, and we came away with really 2 takeaways from all the work that we did over 10 years to find all the secret declassified documents, put them in one place, obtain information, interview every single surviving participant of secret talks that we could find. And the 2 takeaways were that every president since John Kennedy, since Eisenhower really, has talked to the Cubans. We thought, is kind of the common narrative is that it was a heretical idea, it was a heresy to actually talk to the Cubans and negotiate with the Cubans, and yet every president since Eisenhower, since the Cuban Revolution, have actually done it in one form or another. And several presidents, beyond just talking about various issues and mutual interests, had actually tried to change the framework of U.S.-Cuban relations and change the policy from one of hostility to one of engagement. That was one part of the history that we're going to talk about. And the other part of the history is that even though Fidel Castro has this image, perhaps more than any other leader in the world of anti-American rhetoric and tirades against the empire of the North, he actually reached out to every single president very early in most of their terms with some type of message of reconciliation, of potential change, of let's talk, of what would be possible between us. And that is actually a fascinating history. During the Kennedy administration, he sent Che Guevara to Montevideo, Uruguay, to hold the first secret talks with a Kennedy emissary, Richard Goodwin. Che practiced cigar diplomacy. He brought a beautiful box of cigars and gave it to Goodwin. Of course, it was for the President of the United States, and Goodwin tells this wonderful story. When he took the box of cigars back to Kennedy, Kennedy pulled one out, lit it up, took one puff, and looked at Goodwin and said, "Maybe you should take the first puff." And Goodwin responded, "It's too late now, Mr. President." And of course, that was an implicit reference to the legendary efforts by the CIA to poison Fidel Castro's cigars and use cigars as a assassination device. The Cubans preferred to use cigars as a gesture of peace, a peace pipe, if you will. And this was an extraordinarily important meeting. How many of you have heard about this meeting before, in August of 1961? A couple of you. From the book. So, a good place to hear about it. It was at this meeting when the Cubans first said, "We are interested in a dialogue. We are willing to talk about your concerns. The only thing that is not on the negotiating table is our system of governance," a position that Cuba maintained throughout all of these years. "We're willing to talk to you about your concerns. We're not willing to talk to you about us changing the independence of our government, the independence of our foreign policy." Che Guevara had this famous statement that has gone down in history. He told Richard Goodwin, "Thank you for the Bay of Pigs. It helped us consolidate the revolution, and it turned us from an aggrieved little country into an equal." And with that kind of sensibility, the Cubans approached the United States again and again and again. Kennedy and Castro were actually in secret talks literally at the moment that Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Some conspiracy theorists think that this is the reason that he was assassinated in Dallas. And when he was assassinated, Fidel Castro reached out to Lyndon Johnson in the weeks following the assassination. He used a journalist for ABC News to carry a message back to Lyndon Johnson, and this was the message. And it was essentially a question. Did you know we were in talks with the Kennedy administration? Do you want to continue them? We are interested in moving forward for better relations. Please do not consider my effort to reach out to you as a sign of weakness. It is anything but that. But let's see what is possible. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, as you see from the front of the book, met with Fidel Castro in April of 1959. The meeting went very badly. Nixon considered himself an inveterate Castro hater. Fidel felt that Nixon had been completely paternalistic and condescending. You could not think of two people who would want to find common ground. And yet, 10 days after the inauguration of Richard Nixon, Fidel Castro called in the Swiss ambassador, asked him to act as an intermediary, sent a message through the Swiss to Washington. Henry Kissinger interpreted it as a message of détente. Nixon rejected it, but you see Castro reaching out at the very beginning of the term. Ronald Reagan, one of the most sincere Cold Warriors of ever. Fidel Castro repeatedly reached out to the Reagan administration about what might be possible in terms of peace in Central America, in terms of negotiating with the United States, bearing the hatchet. The Reagan administration completely rejected these gestures, as this particular memoranda shows. They just dissed Fidel. They did, however, hold talks on migration and other issues, as many presidents have. And now we turn to the issue of of presidents themselves. It was a bipartisan effort, if you will. Kennedy reaching out to talks about changing the contours of relations with Cuba. During the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger decided at the very end of Nixon's tenure, or abbreviated tenure, as you recall, that it might be wise to talk to the Cubans about completely revamping the relations between the United States and Cuba. And then Jimmy Carter picked up the ball and went forward. And here's kind of examples of the documentary record. During Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy rethought the dangers of the Cold War and continuing to kind of have hostile relations with Cuba. And as McGeorge Bundy said to me when I interviewed him just before he passed away, Kennedy wanted to see what was possible. He still was pursuing covert operations against Cuba, but he wanted to see if peaceful coexistence was possible also. So he started to work through secret emissaries, because it was so politically sensitive to send messages back and forth from Castro's office. He used a lawyer, and he used 2 journalists. And the lawyer was James Donovan, the legendary figure from New York here. And Donovan won Castro's confidence. They negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners, and they started to talk about better relations between the United States of America and Cuba. Donovan went back in the fall of 1963 and negotiated the release of 3 CIA agents and 24 other Americans that were being held there. And that set the stage for trying to have a meeting between a Kennedy emissary and a Castro emissary, either in Cuba or in New York City. This, of course, was all aborted when Kennedy was killed in Dallas. 10 years later, Kissinger decided that perhaps it would be a good idea to have better relations with Cuba. As you remember, Henry Kissinger, he didn't really care about democracy or human rights that much. What he cared about was the strategic chessboard. And if he could actually, get Castro to be more, to screw around in Latin America less and be less of an ally with the Soviet Union, it would be worth having better relations. Latin America was rebelling at the time against the multilateral sanctions the U.S. had imposed, and Kissinger sent a handwritten note to Fidel Castro with a Democrat Party operative named Frank Mankiewicz. And the note basically said, we have things to talk about, and we should do it discreetly. And this is part of the secret history. You see it in the Obama administration's approach as well. This was all done very secretly. It was so politically sensitive. Only a few people would know about what was happening. And Kissinger initiated what ended up being a series of secret meetings here in New York and in Washington. The culmination was a meeting in the Pierre Hotel, not far from here. A real negotiating session. The first time the 2 sides had actually sat down secretly and said, what is on your agenda? What is on our agenda? How can we change relations? And this effort faltered over Castro's decision to send troops into Angola in 1975. Fidel's priority was somewhat more to be head of the non-aligned movement and support the anti-colonial struggle in Africa than to, at that point, normalize relations with Henry Kissinger, of all people, who had just succeeded in overthrowing Salvador Allende in Chile, and there wasn't a lot of trust there. And so that effort actually then just faded away in 1976. But President Carter actually picked up the ball after Gerald Ford lost the election. Carter came in and he had the same philosophy as Barack Obama. We should have better relations with Cuba and with all of our other hostile states that we weren't friends with. And it made sense to have talks. And he became the first president to actually order his bureaucracy, his national security officials to move forward and negotiate a change in policy. And at the beginning, it really seemed very promising, kind of like what we're experiencing right now. The interest sections that are now under discussion to become embassies, those were set up in the first 6 months of the Carter administration through talks with Cubans. And then the talks continued, but they faltered on the same issue. There was a precondition that Carter had. We want you to get out of Africa. And Fidel's response was, I don't tell you what to do with your foreign policy, and you can't tell me what to do with my foreign policy. I don't want any preconditions for normalizing relations, and so I'm not going to get out of Africa. And that is where essentially our relations stood. Many things have happened, but the fundamentals have not changed until this point. A trade for Alan Gross and one other CIA asset for 3 Cuban spies who had come here as kind of counterterrorism agents to basically focus on exile groups that had committed attacks and financed attacks against Cuba. There's a whole long history of terrorism emanating from the shores of the United States. And Cuba, acting rationally like other states, including our own, sent its agents out around the world to gather intelligence, and that's what these agents were doing here. You've heard of them. They were called the Cuban Five. They were part of a network called the Red de Avispas, the WASP network. And 2 of them had gotten out of prison already after 13 or 14 years in prison, and the other 3 were here for a long time, including one, this guy Gerardo Hernandez, who was serving 2 life sentences. And this was what held up Barack Obama's effort to try and open the door towards better relations. The need to get Alan Gross back, this USAID contractor who was part of a regime change program that Congress finances, and open the door. And that is what was accomplished during 18 months of secret talks. We were there in Cuba when they came back. This was the headline. They returned. The celebration in the streets in Cuba was really about their return, but very quickly the sense in Cuba set in among the population that better U.S. relations with Cuba could lead to really a much better situation for the Cuban people economically, if not politically. In the middle of secret talks that have gone on between the United States and Cuba over the last 18 months, Barack Obama had this chance meeting with Raul Castro at Nelson Mandela's funeral. And this picture was taken of the 2 of them shaking hands. And Obama then made a speech, which in some ways was, of course, focused on the spirit of Nelson Mandela, but those of us watching it could clearly feel a sense that perhaps he was talking about also the future of U.S.-Cuban relations. He did act on that. As one official in his administration said, he wanted to do this. He managed to do what no other president had done. And that is because he made no serious preconditions to the Cubans, no demands that they change their political system, change their foreign policy. And he and his aides adopted a tone of true kind of mutual respect in their dealings with the Cubans and all the secret meetings that they've had over these last 2 years. We've now entered a period of open discussion, and perhaps the back channel era is behind us. Bill LeoGrande and I are working on a new epilogue for the book that will be in the paperback edition, where we're going to tell the story of what happened over the last 2 years. But we've arrived at a point right now that is very promising, still difficult, but very promising. To tell you about the promise and the difficulty, I'm going to turn it over to William LeoGrande.
Peter, before we do that, could you comment on the documents that, you used 3 main sources. Documents recently declassified, right? Obtained by National Archives. And then also interviews and what else? Also?
Well, we at my office, the National Security Archive, we work on gathering and pushing for the declassification of secret documents that are relevant to the debate over U.S. foreign policy. And for many years, my office devoted its efforts to getting all the documents released on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and on the Bay of Pigs, and on Operation Mongoose, trying to use the history of aggression to kind of build a discussion about the need for better relations. But about 20 years ago, I started working on a project to get the secret documents of Henry Kissinger's talks with Castro declassified and out into the open. And it became clear to Bill LeoGrande and myself that this history was very rich and much more relevant. eventually we were going to arrive at the point that we've arrived at today. And if one could compile historical precedents for it, one could hasten the day that we had talks on actual better relations. Politically in Washington, it's, you know, how can you talk to the Cubans? You should never talk to the Cubans. The Cubans will never make a deal with you. They'll never keep a deal with you. And history shows otherwise. The Cubans have always wanted to talk. We have talked to them before. It's not heretical at all. It's actually productive and can be positive and arrive at a positive conclusion. So we systematically set out to obtain the declassification of documents that were in presidential libraries, that were still secret in the State Department, in the White House, the National Security Council, and we obtained a series of really critical files that helped us with the book. We then started to systematically interview every single surviving negotiator, and on the US side and on the Cuban side, and we received significant cooperation. We were quite fortunate to have the support of President Carter, who sat down with us and discussed his philosophy and what happened, and President Castro in 2005, when we went to Cuba for our first research trip, also invited us to lunch and shared with us a story about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and how he was used as a secret intermediary between the United States and Cuba. There's a lot of color in this history. There's a lot of richness. There's been Nobel laureates like Garcia Marquez who have gone back and forth. The chairman of the Coca-Cola company was an intermediary between Carter and Castro. And interestingly enough, Jimmy Carter himself became an intermediary, an interlocutor between the United States and Cuba after he left the presidency, many years after he left the presidency, because he was trusted by both. Well, he was trusted more by the Cubans than by the U.S. side, because obviously his agenda was to see better relations. And so the book tells the story about how Bill Clinton fired him as an interlocutor between the United States and Cuba. But the documentary record is quite interesting and dramatic. It'll take us 10 or 15 years to get the documents out on the Obama administration, but I guarantee you we're working on it right now.
Well, let me start by thanking you all for coming, and thanking Mauricio for hosting us here today. As many of you may know, the second round of open negotiations has concluded today. I was following on my iPhone while Peter was talking, not because I was checking my Facebook page, but because I wanted to see if we had any breaking news coming out of that session. But there hasn't been any reported yet, and I think the press conferences are probably still underway. But there have been several issues that have that may hold up quick movement toward the restoration of diplomatic relations, which I think both sides thought initially was going to be pretty quick because both presidents had decided to do it. It only really requires the two sides signing and exchanging diplomatic notes that they're going to do it. But in fact, a couple of issues have come up that have been in contention and were the central focus of the meeting today, and it'll be interesting to see if they were able to resolve them or not. One was Cuba's listing as an international sponsor of terrorism. The Cuban position has been that this is really not compatible with normal diplomatic relations. Now, there's been some play in that, and a senior State Department official, most likely Roberta Jacobson, said on Background yesterday or the day before yesterday that until she sat down at the table with the Cubans, she wasn't sure whether this was a hard and fast prerequisite or whether it was just the Cubans articulating this as high on their agenda. Another issue is that the Cuban interest section, hopefully soon to become an embassy, isn't able to get banking services from anyone because U.S. banks are afraid of the kind of regulatory regime for a country like Cuba, which is under serious economic sanctions. And it's not so much even, I think, that they're afraid they're going to be fined by the United States government. They just don't see sufficient return on investment to invest the time and energy and money it takes to simply comply with the regulatory regime. And so the Cuban position is, well, if we can't open a bank account, how can we have normal diplomatic relations? On the U.S. side, U.S. diplomats want to be able to travel across Cuba and talk with people, which in fact is a normal part of diplomatic operations. The difficulty historically has been that not only have U.S. diplomats traveled around the island talking to people, but they've also met with dissidents, helped organize them, provided them with material resources, which the Cuban side regards as incompatible with their diplomatic status. So the Cubans are trying to get some kind of commitment from the United States that if U.S. diplomats are allowed to travel freely, that they will do so within the confines of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and not in excess of it. So we'll see how much progress. When you go home, turn on the news or go Google News, may not be the lead story on the evening news, to see what progress was made today. I think we're going to see a series of agreements on issues of mutual interest. Leading up to the Summit of the Americas in April of this year, I think we'll see agreements on counter-narcotics cooperation, which has been under discussion for some time, and the Cubans have given us a draft treaty, which is very similar to a treaty they have with, or an agreement rather, not a treaty, but an executive agreement, very similar to one that they have with Great Britain. I think we'll see a postal service agreement. I had the good fortune to talk to one of the postal service people who've been negotiating the restoration of normal postal service, and he said that they're very close there. And I think we may see a bilateral agreement on environmental protection in the Gulf, particularly oil spill prevention and mitigation. The two sides have said they're going to set up working groups to talk about some of the more complex and technical issues simultaneously, so that there'll be ongoing discussions on human rights is one of the areas, law enforcement cooperation is another one of the areas, and the whole issue of claims. Cuba nationalized $1.7 billion in U.S. investments in 1960, which now, with interest, they owe us $7 billion. Cuba has filed counterclaims for the damage done by the embargo and the CIA secret war of the 1960s for over $100 billion. So at some point, the two sides will sit down and trade horses and figure out exactly how they're going to resolve those claims. So I think both sides would like to see some forward motion going into the summit in April. And hopefully it'll be the restoration of diplomatic relations. They'll solve these outstanding issues and do that. And hopefully also there'll be a series of these issues on issues of mutual interest. But for all the hopefulness, and as Peter said, Obama has really changed the framework of U.S. relations away from regime change and toward engagement and coexistence. There are still a lot of issues outstanding between Cuba and the United States that it's going to take some time to work through. The embargo, of course, is still in place. The president has punched some new holes in it, so telecommunications companies now can do business with Cuban state enterprises to expand Cuban internet access. Agricultural interests can sell food and medicine to Cuba, and U.S. businesses are going to be able to sell and buy things from Cuban private enterprises, which is a growing sector in the Cuban economy. And that, I think, in some ways in the future has the greatest potential, although for the time being, the Cuban private sector is still very, very small and very labor rather than capital intensive. And so therefore, they're not going to, I don't think, be buying enormous amounts of goods from the United States. But it's still not legal for U.S. residents or citizens to invest in Cuba. It's still not legal to trade other goods and services with Cuban state enterprises. And so there's still a very long way to go on the embargo. The United States continues to conduct democracy promotion programs, which were, under the Bush administration, aimed at regime change. And so this is really a kind of vestige of the old policy, if you will. These programs were designed to stimulate opposition to the Cuban government. The administration has said that those programs are not going to go away. It has said that repeatedly in public and up on Capitol Hill. I think the question is whether or not those programs will be refocused in a way that makes them more authentic carriers of civil society connections between Cuba and the United States, as opposed to government programs that have this regime change focus to them. But we'll have to wait and see. A recent request for proposals that came out of the State Department just 5 days after December 17th sounded just like the request for proposals that came out before. We still spend millions of dollars every year broadcasting TV and radio Marti to Cuba, even though most Cubans don't see or hear it. The Cuban Adjustment Act is still in place. This is the act that allows Cubans who reach the United States to adjust their status to permanent residency with a fast track to citizenship after a year and a day. The wet foot, dry foot policy of immigration is still in place, meaning that Cubans who are picked up at sea still go back to Cuba, but Cubans who reach the United States are paroled into the community and adjust their status after a year. Cuba has long argued that this is a spur to illegal immigration and to human trafficking, which I think is undoubtedly the case, but the administration has said the Cuban Adjustment Act is not going to be reviewed or revisited, that they're content with it in place as it is. Part of the reason for that is a fear that if they even suggest that they're looking at the Cuban Adjustment Act, that they will trigger a wave of migration out of Cuba. The very improvement in relations created a fear among people in Cuba that the Cuban Adjustment Act might be repealed, and the attitude was, well, if we're going to go, we better go now. And so there was a surge, actually, of people leaving illegally as a result of that, and I think that scared the administration into these very uncompromising statements that the Cuban Adjustment Act not going to change. The United States has in place something called the Cuban Medical Personnel Parole Program, in which we offer fast-track residency and citizenship to Cuban health workers serving on humanitarian missions abroad in order to get them to defect. That program prevented Cuba and the United States from deeper cooperation in response to the earthquake in Haiti. And I think personally that it's not compatible with the kind of cooperation that Cuba and the United States have had in the fight against Ebola in West Africa. Cooperation that has been very positive, but episodic and happens on an ad hoc basis and can't become more systematic because of this program. That's another program the administration has said it has no intention of reviewing. And then, of course, there's Guantanamo. Cuba still wants it back. The United States is still not willing to give it back. And because the president has not yet been able to fulfill his campaign promise of closing the detention center there, I think we're quite a ways off from that being on the table for discussion. One of the issues that has been raised by Republicans in particular is the issue of U.S. fugitives who have found sanctuary in Cuba. Estimates are that there are 70 or so. That's the number one sees over and over again. Many of those, if not most, are in fact common criminals who have stayed in Cuba simply because there is not a functioning extradition treaty between Cuba and the United States. There is a treaty. It's never been abrogated, but it isn't functional because after the revolution, when Cuba requested the extradition of some of Batista's henchmen, the United States refused to turn them over. And since then, the treaty has been dormant. But there are also some fugitives, like Joanne Chesimard, who have been given political asylum in Cuba and who the Cubans, I don't believe, are going to turn over to the United States any more than we would turn over some Cuban Americans who the Cubans regard as terrorists. So that is going to be, I think, an issue of ongoing conflict. It's clearly an issue that the opponents of this opening to Cuba have seized upon. If you follow the news, it's become part of their talking points that how can you take Cuba off the list of terrorist sponsoring countries if they're harboring these terrorists from the United States. So why did this happen now? I mean, you know, we wrote this book, and as Peter said, there were a number of attempts in the past to make this happen. And I think the reason that it didn't work for Henry Kissinger and it didn't work for Jimmy Carter was that there's never before this moment, been a time when normalizing the relationship was at the top of the agenda of both countries. In the 70s, the Cubans were more interested in their policy in Africa. They didn't think the two things should be linked, but forced to choose, they were more interested in their policy in Africa. And after the Cold War, the United States really didn't see an interest in improving relations with Cuba, even though it was much higher on the Cuban agenda. But I think two things happened that, or three things, I guess I'll say, happened that brought the two countries together at this particular moment. On the U.S. side, it's clear that the diplomatic cost of this policy to the United States in Latin America has gone up dramatically in the last several years. The Latin Americans are just fed up with this policy and see it as symbolic of the unwillingness of the United States to treat Latin American neighbors as equals. And the president saw that firsthand in Cartagena, Colombia at the last summit. It was clear he was going to see it again at this summit because the Latin Americans invited Cuba to participate over the objection of the United States. And I think that that rising cost diplomatically was, and I know that that was a very important motivating factor for the administration. The other thing that changed the calculus in the United States is not on the policy side, but on the political side, and that was the changing politics of the Cuban American community in Florida. It's clear over the years that the community has become increasingly moderate in its political views as more and more recent arrivals have become citizens and have begun to vote. They are people who came more for economic than political reasons. They maintain contact with their families. They send remittances. They travel back and forth. And for them, a normal relationship between the two governments is a good thing, not a bad thing. And they have started to vote. And you could see it in the last presidential election when President Obama got half the Cuban American vote in Florida, more than any other Democrat since Lyndon Johnson. I don't know how many Cuban Americans were voting when Lyndon Johnson was president, probably not too many. So that's on the U.S. side. On the Cuban side, I think the economic updating of the model that Raul Castro launched in 2011 clearly depends upon Cuba becoming more integrated into the world economy. The United States is the obvious and natural trade partner of Cuba. It's also an obvious source of tourists, which is now one of the key elements in the Cuban economy. And it's obviously also a source of potential investment. Cuba believes it needs about $2.5 billion of new direct foreign investment every year in order to sustain the level of economic growth that it seeks to have. And the United States is the logical source of that investment. So normalizing relations with the United States is a natural and important element for the long-term success of the economic changes that are underway in Cuba today. You know, I think we're going to have a policy debate, and we're already having a policy debate here. But one of the things that I'm struck with is that when the president announced this, how positive the domestic political response here was. There have been 4 or 5 opinion polls that have been done since December 17th, and the general public is in support of this policy 2-to-1. That is to say, 60, 65, 70% of the population supports what the president has done. Even among Cuban Americans, there is at least a plurality of support for what the president has done. There are some vocal members of Congress on the other side, both Democrats and Republicans, and right now they are dominating the debate in Congress, and they have therefore a podium, if you will, built-in podium to raise issues, but they have yet been able to answer the fundamental challenge that the president put to them on December 17th, which is, for 54 years, the policy of austerity hasn't worked. It hasn't produced anything. The new policy hasn't even been in place yet for 54 days, so I think we ought to give it a little more time to see how it works out. Thank you very much.
Bill and Peter, as you move to explain why normalization failed during 11 presidencies and then now it seems to be succeeding, I think you have our sketch theory of why now, especially that is now what is now different is that both countries face international relations and local conditions in which the hogs, so to speak, have lost political space, and the doves of perhaps, or at least the pragmatism governments have. That would be a correct restatement of what you just said, that in fact, in both places you have pragmatics and those in favor of change toward normalization gain space.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Could you just microphone?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm sure that there are people on the Cuban side who look at this with some trepidation, huh? That they worry that, well, in fact, if you saw Fidel's statement about this in his letter to the Federation of University Students, it was very lukewarm. He essentially said, well, of course, we're always in favor of peaceful settlement of disputes among peoples, and the president acted under his prerogative. And that's all he said. I mean, he really didn't actually endorse what Raul had done. And in fact, he said, you know, I've never trusted the United States.
And I never trust.
Yeah, well, and I think what's interesting though, is that despite that skepticism, as Peter said, every new U.S. president, he reached out to see whether there some sort of reconciliation was positive. You know, I wonder if maybe he's just angry we didn't do it with him instead of waiting for Raul.
So you think that is Raul in that framework represent a change to Fidel, or no? Well, you don't know.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't have had the agreements we've had so far if he was
Fidel.
Well, I mean, if Raul wasn't a pragmatist who saw it in the interests of Cuba to normalize relations with the United States, we wouldn't be moving in that direction.
I think many people have asked over the years why it didn't succeed. There are many political figures out there, including Hillary Clinton, who said that the Cubans sabotaged efforts as they seem to be coming to fruition over the years. We really need her to read the book so she understands what actually happened in this history. But what you see with Fidel Castro is he always put principle over pragmatism, the principles of the revolution. And when it came to a choice of whether he was going to be a leader of the third world and revolution and anti-colonial struggle in the third world, or whether he was going to normalize relations with Henry Kissinger, kind of the most hated figure in the entire third world, you know, he chose to be a leader and pursue the principles of the revolution. I think there are a number of times when this might have come to fruition, but the difference right now is, A, the political stars aligned, as Bill pointed out. B, both countries had it, I think, higher in their agenda. You know, President Obama has a lot of other things on his foreign policy agenda. But he came into the presidency in 2008, was elected president, campaigning on the need to, quote, write a new chapter in US-Cuban relations. He and all of his top aides understood that this policy was a non-starter and didn't make any sense. And I think the momentum towards changing it was interrupted by a kind of a residual aftermath of the Bush administration, in which Alan Gross, who was contracted under the Bush administration to go to Cuba and set up kind of illicit satellite communications channels with the United States independent of the Cuban government, his arrest really created, slowed this process down considerably, stopped it altogether. And it took until the second term, it took a lot of lobbying, a lot of pushing, a lot of individuals involved, other countries, other leaders, to eventually get to the point where getting Alan Gross out, trading these Cuban agents for him was possible. And then what you see is the administration, seemingly having read the extraordinary lessons that Bill LeoGrande laid out at the back of the book, went ahead and just unilaterally decided to change the policy.
Wait, at 5:05 or 5:10, they pick up the coffee there that you see there. So please, if you need coffee or tea, avail yourself of whatever they have a few more minutes before they pick it up. The facilities there. So you would say, and this is the end of my privileges here to exploit my time. You would say that would you say that in both places you have a consensus or near consensus among people within the state apparatus, política de Estado, as they might be said in Spanish or Portuguese, that you have a consensus among various factions of the ruling groups
I'm not sure.
about the reconciliation policy?
I'm not sure I'd go that far. I mean, I think, I think we know in the United States that there's difference of opinion about this. I mean, we can see conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats that are actively opposed to what the president is doing. I am sure there are people in the government bureaucracy and the Department of State and other agencies.
Intelligence?
Possibly in the intelligence community, although I will say that the Department of Defense in some ways has been more interested in improving relations with Cuba than the Department of State has been. The professional military people would like to have a relationship. They don't see Cuba as a threat. So every year, the commander of U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, presents what's called a posture statement to the Congress of the United States. And then he lays out the issues facing him in his command and the threats that they face and how they're meeting them. And since 2000, Cuba has never appeared as a military threat in the posture statement. It only gets mentioned twice, and that is fears of a possible migration crisis when Fidel got sick and stepped down. And that's it. So the military people understand that Cuba is not a threat, but they would like to see cooperative relations in the way that the two Coast Guards have actually built very cooperative relations, in the way that the two militaries, local militaries, have built cooperation around the border of Guantanamo.
Would it be fair to say that the U.S. side is fearful, at least some people in the government, of a failed state in Cuba if the ruling leaders die out and there's a crisis? Is that a fair statement?
I don't think so. I think that in the book we talk about a moment in time during the Clinton administration when the collapse of the Soviet Union created what the Cubans called a special period, and the economy basically sank into the ocean. And at that point, you do see memo after memo about Cuba becoming a failed state and about the implosion of the entire country and the refugees that would come and the civil strife that would ensue and the interest of the United States to try and figure out a way to keep that from happening. And I think that U.S. policymakers gravitated away from ideas by some Republican presidents, particularly the second George Bush, that we should, as Robert Torricelli once put it, wreak havoc on the island, squeeze and pressure the island until it just exploded. That wasn't really much in U.S. interests, and that our interests are to build bridges, help what would be an inevitable evolution, certainly economically, if not eventually politically. So I don't think that's a concern today. Cuba survived this special period. They're still emerging from it, but there's no sign of any instability whatsoever there.
Yeah, I agree with that, although let me say that I think the president did mention in his speech to the nation that it's not in the interest of the United States to see a collapse in Cuba. I think not because he anticipates one, but rather to point out that the policy of hostility, the 54-year policy of hostility, not only didn't it work, but if it worked, it wouldn't be in the interest of the United States.
We'll take questions 3 at a time, and then we'll stop and then give you a chance to reply. We'll take 3 more questions. Please try to be succinct, to the point, so to give a chance to other speakers. Julie.
I have attended many interesting panels here, hosted by Mauricio, on the change, the dramatic but slow change in the Cuban American community in the direction of exactly what we talked about. And it was super refreshing to hear this wonderful presentation that did not depend on an understanding of where were the Cuban Americans at any particular point as the explanatory variable for what various presidents were willing to secretly negotiate. Is it in the book anyway, and you chose not to emphasize it? I didn't miss it, I have to say, but I was wondering if you tried to bring that together. Did you look at the political side along with the diplomatic side?
There's one question. There's one. Let's take one from this side. Yes.
Can you talk about the travel restrictions, please,
Travel
on
restrictions.
both sides?
And yes.
I would like to, right now, they said that Cuba would not be a threat to the United States. Right now, the Russian presence in the Caribbean is not there because the year 214 is pretty much new, but they're planning to be in Cuba as one of the bases of Russians.
So your question is that a threat? Is that a threat?
Right.
Right, you have 3 questions.
Okay. So we most certainly talk about the politics of this issue throughout the book, because you can't, you can have the best policy in the world, but if the politics of it don't work, forget about it, right? So we do talk about that. I think in some ways, under Republican presidents, the conservatives in the Cuban American community are pushing on an open door. All right? That is to say, they've got presidents that basically would be doing this even if they didn't exist. But I think they had a big influence on the Clinton administration. And so I think, and I think that's reflected in our chapter. The tension actually, which Clinton himself talks about, between on the one hand, understanding that from a policy point of view, the old policy didn't make any sense. But from a political point of view, he didn't want to give up the possibility of winning enough Cuban American votes to carry forward. And he talks very explicitly about feeling that tension. Travel restrictions. Well, what the president has done in these new regulations is to grant general licenses for the 12 categories of travel that are allowed under the law. The one thing he did not do, which he could have, is under the people-to-people educational travel, which is how most of you would probably go. You still have to go through a licensed travel provider. You still can't just go on your own. Right? And so while I think more people will want to go to Cuba just because the relationship now is changing, and it'll be a little more convenient to go because eventually you'll be able to use your credit cards instead of having to carry hundreds of dollars or thousands in cash. You're still going to have to go through a licensed travel provider, and you can't go on your own. On the Cuban side, of course, as we know, the Cuban government now in 2013 lifted the requirement for most Cubans that they have to get permission before they can travel abroad. Now, for most Cubans, all you need is a valid passport. And as a result of that, actually, the number of Cubans coming to visit the United States in non-immigrant status has dramatically gone up in the last 2 years.
You want to speak to the Russians?
Yeah, well, the Russians, I think the Russians would love to get back into Cuba. Putin clearly is interested in reviving Russia's global presence. I think as the United States fiddles around in Ukraine, he would love to do something on our border just to remind us that we're not immune to that. And I think the Cubans are happy to get Russian trade credits. But I don't think that the Cubans are interested in restoring the kind of military partnership they had with the Russians before the end of the Cold War. So while that is a reasonable concern on the part of the United States, in some ways the policy of opening to Cuba and drawing Cuba closer to us, right, can be a counterweight to Cuba being closer to the Soviet Union. We should keep in mind that it was in 1960 when the United States canceled the Cuban sugar quota, thereby declaring economic war on the revolution. It was Russia that stepped in, or the Soviet Union that stepped in and bought up the sugar the United States would. And Khrushchev writes in his memoirs that when that happened, he knew that Cuba would be drawn to the Soviet Union like iron filings to a magnet. So we should learn that lesson and not make that same mistake again.
I wanted to just pick up on the travel issue, if I can. We're sitting here today, and there's really two dramas going on, two real debates. There's a serious negotiations between Cuba and the United States at the executive level, and those meetings have taken place all day today, and we'll hear momentarily about whether they were constructive, whether they advanced. Then there's the debate that's going on in the US Congress about consolidating or not, consolidating or undermining, consolidating, advancing versus undermining and sabotaging what the president is trying to do to change Cuba policy. And that debate is moving very, very quickly and forcefully. We see it because we're in Washington, a little bit closer than you do, but you've certainly heard about it and read about it. It's very, very important. Travel is going to be the first issue legislatively that gets discussed. And in just a few days, a Republican senator, Jeff Flake from Arizona, is leading a delegation to Cuba. He has introduced a bill to completely lift the prohibitions and restrictions on travel altogether so that U.S. citizens could freely travel, not under any licensed provider, do whatever they want when they go there. They can go, visit art galleries, go, dance salsa, or
lie on the beach.
If they want to go to Veradero Beach and stay in a hotel there like 1.1 million Canadians do every year, and a lot of other tourists that come to Cuba, they could do that too. And that debate seems, in some ways, should be the easiest one to win because it's about your rights and our rights, not about Cuba, really, and Cuban rights. It's turned into an argument that we're going to spend money in Cuba and therefore, give the regime a lifeline, but it's really about whether we have freedom to travel or not. We're the only citizens that don't have freedom to travel to Cuba and really in the world, in a sense. And Cuba's one of the, I don't know if there's even another place that we're not allowed to travel to. And it doesn't make any sense because anybody who goes to Cuba, how many of you have been to Cuba? A lot of you. You all know.
Much for the travel ban, right?
I mean, you all know that there's no threat to our security there, that this doesn't make any sense. So I think that one of the interesting differences and tensions, if you bring these two things together, these two dramas together, is that we are in the United States, and I told this to the Cuban press yesterday morning as they accompanied Josefina Vidal to Washington. In the United States, we're in a presidential cycle. Obama has 2 years left. The last year will be consumed by the political campaign in many ways, and him trying to do what he can before he leaves office. But it's a very short timetable. And so people who are working to consolidate and push forward his agenda on Cuba feel a sense of pressure and the need for a sense of momentum. In Cuba, there isn't a presidential cycle, frankly. Their political system is, frankly, much different than ours. And they don't feel the same pressure, and there's some reticence, certainly within the ruling circles, about what this really means, particularly if it moves fast. And so you have a sense of the Cubans wanting to proceed somewhat more methodically and more patient with the process. But this is what you're going to see analytically. You can divide these dramas up, and you can play a role in the drama in Washington, of course. And the other one, well, we'll see what happens.
Peter, will the Cubans judge adequately that the window of opportunity in the U.S. is not as wide as they think? Or as one may want for negotiating?
I'm sure that they have a number of analysts who are already, looking at presidential candidates and that issue. But there are some discussion going on in Cuba. I was just in Cuba all of last week with a delegation of 60 people. I know you were in Cuba last week as well, and our paths almost crossed. But there's some people there who are concerned that, in fact, that the new approach by Obama is not a sincere approach, that it's simply a different tactic. Since the other tactic hasn't worked for 54 years, try something new towards the same objective of undermining the Cuban Revolution. And that argument is being made. I don't think it's Raul's position necessarily, but certainly he's hearing it from others. I was in Cuba, and I met with a number of analysts last week, and I kept hearing again and again, well, Assistant Secretary Jacobson came down here and she said, our objectives are the same even if our strategy is different. And this quote kept being repeated to me as if it was an argument that nothing really has changed. And I very passionately made the argument that something very serious has changed in the United States of America. And if that change is going to be consolidated, we have to work.
So are you an optimist or a pessimist about progress over the next 12 months?
My mother used to call me Peter Pessimist when I was growing up, but I'm optimistic that this process will move forward over the next year. That particularly the issue, this is a Republican Senate, a Republican Congress. The issue of whether the votes are there is tough. I can tell you from being there, I was there where 3 senators were there: Senator Warner, Claire McCaskill, and the senator from Minnesota who had introduced the lift the embargo bill, Klobuchar. Yeah. And then I was there when Nancy Pelosi and her delegation came down as well. And these congressional delegations are coming because they want to, in some ways, enlist the Cubans in helping to change votes in Republican states that could be selling soybeans and corn and pork and lumber and many other goods to Cuba. And if Cuba is open to starting to negotiate contracts in these strategic states, then the Republican votes from those states might come the way of lifting the embargo.
Hey, you want to come in?
No, why don't we get back to the audience? I have a lot of hands in the
Can I
audience.
ask a follow-up on the travel?
Yes, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
You mentioned, you didn't address the issue of some Cuban Americans who want to travel to Cuba. And for a number of months now, there was a limit. You could only go to Cuba if you have a travel pass and a Cuban passport, which is almost impossible to get for many Cubans, depending on what you come. I'm Cuban American. I have been there a number of times. I've taken students and all that. And I found myself, when I was trying to take students back in September, that the PE11 visa, which would apply to me, would not be given. Now it changed. Yes, I checked with that. And now it changed and said if you came before 1970, you could possibly apply for that visa.
Right.
So it's an issue that the restrictions of
so the question,
Castro,
what is your question?
My restrictions on the Castro government letting some Cubans who are not politically involved, just to visit Cuba.
Okay, you had yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about Asada Shakur and the relationship of them protecting her there in the negotiations in Washington right now, and the relation with that to getting Cuba off the U.S. terrorist list. If that's if you could discuss a little bit more about that.
Mariana.
The issue, you said that there was going to be conversation about human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know very clearly what the U.S. position is on human rights, and Josefina Vidal has also made statements around that. Can you elaborate more on what you think the context of it is and how it's going to shift?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be very oppositional.
John, did you have an announcement to make?
Well, but the announcement is there is no announcement.
Okay.
There was supposed to have been a live press briefing this afternoon after the negotiations, and it just got pulled from the White House or from the State Department webpage. So I don't know what that is.
So there was no press conference afterwards?
But it could still be that they're still talking, that the meetings are...
That'd be my hopeful conclusion.
They might actually be working 9 to 5 rather than
Right.
9 to 4.
It was very weird because I'm standing here watching it and waiting for it to come on, and then all of a sudden it disappears.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah.
Yes.
No, actually, we have 3 questions. We have 3. Can we reply to those 3? We have.
Sure. So on the terrorism list, let me start with that. The terrorism list is governed by a statute which lays out the statutory rationale for why a country should be put on the terrorism list, and lays out a procedure, a process, whereby a country can be delisted from the list. And that process, excuse me, involves a review to see whether or not Cuba or any country has met the criteria for being delisted, which is that there's been a change in government and policy, or that the country in question has not committed acts of support for international terrorism in the last 6 months and has given assurances that it won't do so in the future. That, when that review is done by the Department of State, the Secretary of State makes a recommendation to the President makes a determination, and if it's to take the country off the list, it's reported to Congress. Congress has 45 days then to consider what the President has done, and they can basically reject it, but only by actually passing a joint resolution, that is to say a law, which the President, of course, has the right to veto. Where we are right now in the Cuba case is the review is underway. And there was a statement from a senior official that the review is close to being concluded. It may well be that the review will be concluded before the Summit of the Americas, and that the President will therefore have an opportunity to make his determination before the Summit of the Americas. And that may be sufficient to get that issue off the agenda for normalizing diplomatic relations. We don't have enough time left for it to actually go all the way through the 45-day waiting period in Congress. But since Congress really doesn't have much chance of being able to overturn it, one would think the Cubans might be satisfied just with the presidential determination. Great question on human rights. So I think the first thing that will happen is that the two sides will say what they think is wrong with the human rights in the other country, and that won't be very productive by and large. But Cuba has already made some commitments on the issue as a result of the secret negotiations in terms of being more cooperative with the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the recommendations that were made by the Commission to the Cuban government a couple of years ago, some of which have been implemented and some of which have not been. So I'm sure the United States will be asking about Cuba's commitment to take up some of those additional recommendations. Cuba has agreed to cooperate more with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which used to do visits to Cuban prisons to look at the conditions in those prisons. I'm sure the United States will be pressing Cuba to meet that commitment by allowing the Red Cross to resume prison visits. Cuba, of course, has signed a number of international conventions and covenants with regard to human rights issues, and I'm sure the United States will be pointing out to Cuba its obligations under some of those international agreements that Cuba itself has signed and therefore ought to be complying with. And then Cuba will do the same to us on some of those things. So I think there actually is space for some improvement in how the Cuban government deals with human rights issues coming out of this. And the reason I say that, even though Cuba has historically regarded human rights demands by the United States as interference in its internal affairs. But at the same time, on more than one occasion, Cuba has been willing to do things as a matter of its own sovereign decision-making to improve human rights, particularly releasing political prisoners, as a way of trying to set the stage or create an environment for better relations with the United States. And so I look at those historical precedents under the Carter administration when Cuba released 3,000 political prisoners, and back in, I want to say, 2010 or 12, when, as a result of discussions with the Catholic Church and Spain, Raul Castro released over 100 political prisoners, that there is some space for improvement on that issue. And on the question of Cuban-American travel, I will confess ignorance. I don't know the details of that. I would certainly hope that one of the things that would come out of this improvement in relations is that it would be easier for Cuban Americans to be able to go back and visit. But I haven't actually seen or heard anything around that issue.
Yeah, it's been a long,
it's a long-standing issue, I know.
Right,
yeah.
You know, and it has been worse over the past few years. You know, like I was able to go without any problem in the early 2000s.
And do you know why it's gotten worse? No?
I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, part of it is the bank.
Well, part of it is no, but that's that's more recent. That's very recent.
No, that's more recent, you know, and you know, you can get a Cuban passport provided, you know, that you have an old Cuban passport that you pay a certain amount of money. So if they can receive and transfer that money, you know, why can't they get the cost of a visa? You know, just a regular visa. Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on the terrorism issue, the terrorism list issue. The book talks about the origins of how Cuba came to be put on the terrorism list when the Reagan administration started threatening Cuba to get out of Central America or else. And the or else that they could come up with was putting Cuba on this list when they didn't get the answer from Fidel Castro through their secret communications with him that they wanted. Cuba doesn't belong on the list. It's an insult to Cuba to have been kept on the list. If you read the rationale that the State Department writes, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, for keeping Cuba on the list, it reads the opposite. It's an argument for taking Cuba off the list because everybody in the State Department that's writing this, the people that are writing this, know that Cuba should not be on the list. The Chesimard case is one of the several political footballs that you're going to see thrown around already by presidential candidates such as Chris Christie and opponents of this change. Joanne Chesimard is a fugitive from justice. She escaped from prison after being convicted of participating in the shooting of a police officer. That's a horrible crime, but she's not an international terrorist. And she's a criminal. She was convicted of a criminal act. And that's no rationale to have Cuba on the list, even though the opponents of this policy are trying to make it a rationale. Not only did Cuba give her political asylum way back when, but the person who gave her the political asylum personally was Fidel Castro. And in Cuba, they are loath. The government there just doesn't want to overturn decisions that he made. That is part of their commitment to his leadership as he fades into reclusion of old age, frankly. And so none of the people that got political asylum are going to be returned, and that's a complete non-starter. And I don't really think that administration is going to take it seriously, even though the opponents of this policy are elevating it to a level that it doesn't deserve.
See another round of questions. Again, be as succinct as you possibly can. Anthony De Palma.
Very quickly, just want to acknowledge all the great work that the National Security Archive has done for decades. Fabulous stuff. But Peter Pessimist, what can go wrong here? I mean, if Fidel dies, if Venezuela really sinks, if a Republican is elected, what happens?
Right. Well, no, that's right. It's only one question.
One question.
By the way, I am a little worried because I did know Peter's mother. I know how accurate she was in her so, Joyce was a great lady, and so I'm a bit worried.
One of the things that I think affected the Cuban government's decisions to negotiate was the situation in Venezuela, lowering the price of oil and the internal problems of the Venezuelan government. Now, you didn't mention that. I would like to hear your opinion about it. And the other thing is, there are some people here in the United States who would like to use the fact that the Cuban government might lose Venezuelan support to try to get some sort of concessions from the Cuban government by following a policy of lifting the embargo conditionally, with certain conditions attached. Is that the fact that the Venezuelan subsidies are in danger of being lost? Will that create a possibility to use a policy of conditionally lifting the embargo to get some sort of concessions from the Cuban government?
Did you understand the question?
Oh, yeah.
Very good. Let's take a third one from this side. Yes, you have your hand up.
Yeah, two parts to it. One is you mentioned foreign direct investment. Primarily it's been Canada, Spain, and some other European countries that have invested heavily in the tourism industry in Cuba. I was just recently in Bahamas and some other places. As you know, tourism plays an integral role in their economy. As Cuba ramps that up and the United States normalizes the opportunity for the largest consumers in the world, meaning us, going there, can you espouse on what implications that'll have for Cuba, short-term and long-term? The other is, there's three very powerful individuals. They happen to be Hispanic, and they're all Cuban, and they sit in the Senate. All three of them are Cuban. One is Bobby Menendez in New Jersey. The other is Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, two potential candidates on the Republican side. Bobby Menendez, as you know, is a very powerful individual on foreign affairs, and he's been very lukewarm. As a matter of fact, he's come out against some of these. I'd like you to also espouse upon that in your insight, being down there in the Beltway.
All right, we have a chance for replying to these questions. Then we'll take all kinds of questions, one last burst of questions.
Okay.
Because Peter has to go and meet somebody.
Yeah, but I don't have time.
You have time?
For quite a while.
We still have time. Okay, let's.
So let me start with Venezuela, because I've just published yesterday a post on foreignpolicy.com on exactly this issue. And I think that the whole notion that, you know, the Republicans are pushing that, you know, Cuba is on the brink of collapse if they lose Venezuelan oil subsidies, and all we had to do was wait and we'd have been able to extract all kinds of concessions, is absolutely nonsense. Now, it's built around a couple of kernels of truth. The Cuban economy is not doing very well, right? Last year, growth was 1.3%. And Venezuela is a mess economically. And the falling price of oil is aggravating that mess. And it may very well be that Venezuela will have to cut back on the oil price subsidies it provides under Petrocaribe to all of its neighbors in the Caribbean. But Cuba has a privileged position with Caracas when it comes to that oil, because Cuba pays for it with the work of 40,000 medical personnel. And those people are the backbone of the Venezuelan healthcare system, especially in poor neighborhoods, which is the base of the Maduro government. So that's the last place that Maduro is going to cut back on oil shipments. And in fact, last year, oil shipments to Petrocaribe in general were cut back by about 19%, but Cuba got its entire allocation. And I think the reason is that privileged position. So that's one thing. So even though Venezuela is a mess, the probability that there's going to be a sudden massive cut in Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba is unlikely. Second, even if Venezuelan oil went away tomorrow, the impact on the Cuban economy, to the extent that a very good Cuban economist, Pedro Vidal, has actually done a macroeconomic analysis of this, is that the Cuban economy would contract by about 7.7% of gross domestic product. Now that's a terrible recession, but during the special period, Cuba's gross domestic product fell by 35%, and the government didn't fall. So the idea that somehow even a sudden disappearance of Venezuelan oil is going to collapse the Cuban government is also nonsense. And keep in mind, Fidel, well, you don't know it, Fidel did this analysis a year ago when the price of oil was $100 a barrel. Today, it would cost Cuba half as much to replace the Venezuelan oil that it lost. And finally, even if the Cuban economy was suffering tremendously as a result of the loss of Venezuelan oil, the idea that they would make fundamental political concessions to the United States as a result of that is also nonsense, because for 54 years they've never, even in the depths of the special period, been willing to do that. So this whole argument, frankly, is just a canard. It's, it's put forward by people who, for 54 years, have been saying, you know what, success in destabilizing this regime is just around the corner. All we have to do is wait a little bit longer, and for this reason or that reason or the next reason, this regime will fall or be willing to make concessions. They were wrong in 1959 when they said that, and they're wrong still today.
I just wanted to, I'll pick up on the issue of, well, I want to, there's a point about Venezuela that's fascinating, and that is, one of the reasons that the Latin American community as a whole, really as a whole, has pushed the United States to come to terms with Cuba is because they have a different approach and a kind of long-term assessment of what's going on in Venezuela, and they're quite concerned about it. And the situation in Venezuela is becoming dire and could become an example of extreme civil strife in the region. The Latin American countries who are savvy about this understand that there is one influential player. If the Venezuelan military decides to move, for example, to kind of baldly take power in Venezuela, and that's the Cubans. And they would like the issue of the US-Cuban relationship resolved so that the Cubans are freer, in a sense, to play a mediating role if all hell breaks loose in Venezuela. And that's, I think, an interesting kind of position that they've shared quietly with the United States. There's a lot that could go wrong here, and to understand it, we really have to be clear about the misconceptions about what has happened. It's not really that Cuba and the United States have negotiated up to December 17th an effort to normalize relations. They negotiated a prisoner exchange in which Alan Gross and a long-standing CIA asset that had been imprisoned in Cuba would come to the United States, and the remaining 3 agents would return to Cuba. In addition to that, the Obama administration said to the Cubans, given that this is going to happen, we are now going to move unilaterally to change our policy. Something we've wanted to do, but we haven't felt we can do with Alan Gross in your prison, but we're going to do it now. And we would like to see better treatment for political prisoners, the freedom for 53 that are on this list, more respect for human rights, an opening for the whole issue of the internet and telecom discussions, and we want to invite you to participate now in talks for normalizing diplomatic relations. And the Cubans said yes, but this isn't a position that the Cubans brought to the table, saying we want this, this, and this, and this. It was something that the Obama administration offered and said they were going to do at the point when they could effect this change. And now, of course, you have enemies of this process, particularly in the U.S. Senate and U.S. Congress. If they are strong enough, they could, depending on how Obama approaches naming an ambassador, if that ambassador is going to have to go through some kind of nomination process, that could be defeated. The travel ban could be defeated. The effort to try and lift the embargo, if it ever came to a vote, or could be defeated, or none of these things could actually come to a vote because the Republican leadership could simply prevent it from happening. And if the Cubans' takeaway on this is this isn't really going to move forward, then of course the process might start to slow down considerably. On the Cuban side, there are people that are suspicious of this whole process. And the biggest obstacle, in some ways, is the history of U.S. policy towards Cuba. And Barack Obama, I think, astutely has understood this for many years. He understands that it's going to take a lot to overcome the mistrust that has been built up over 50 years of U.S. efforts to roll back the Cuban Revolution. But I think he's committed to it. Another possible problem is the summit. The summit is going to evoke a lot of expectations, but it also is understood by the enemies of this process to be a great opportunity. And there's a lot of pressure on the administration to take kind of a delegation along with President Obama of members of the dissident community from Cuba and from around the world. Whether the Cubans kind of understand and kind of roll with the politics of this, or become insulted by the kind of attention that this draws, remains to be seen. I think Bill LeoGrande is absolutely correct that President Obama is going to announce that he's taking Cuba off the terrorism list as he prepares to go to the summit. The logic of normalizing diplomatic relations with a country that is on the terrorism list escapes everybody. Frankly, the reason I think that the president did not take Cuba off the list as he announced all these other changes was because that would have alerted a lot of people in the State Department that there was a big change afoot. And this was secret diplomacy, and it had to be kept secret in order for this prisoner exchange to succeed. Immediately, the ball started rolling on this review. I'm sure that the timetable is for the president to include this as a kind of tone setter for the summit. And the summit can become, on the positive side, a tremendous opportunity for positive momentum going forward to the last months of the Obama administration.
And that's the pessimistic view. Let me answer the foreign direct investment question, which we skipped over. There's a very good study that was done by someone at the IMF looking at the impact of U.S. Tourism if the travel ban was lifted completely and U.S. tourists could go. And the estimate there was that it could be as many as 3 million U.S. tourists annually going to Cuba. Now, Cuba couldn't possibly absorb that. I mean, last year they had 3 million tourists go to Cuba, 3 million international visitors, broadly speaking, and they don't have the capacity to suddenly absorb double that number of people. But of course, the tourism ban is still in place, and it's going to take an act of Congress to get rid of it. And so it may actually be a while before the tourism ban itself is gone. It'll be interesting to see how much travel increases now under the people-to-people category now that it's become more convenient. And I'm sort of two minds about that. On the one hand, as I said earlier, I think because you still have to go through a licensed travel provider, for the ordinary person wanting to go on a trip, it's not all that much easier than it used to be. On the other hand, the fact that the relationship between the two countries is no longer as adversarial as it once was, I think is taking away the fear that many people had about going. And I hear people, more and more people say to me, well, I want to go before everything changes and there's a Starbucks on every corner. So it may very well be that tourism is going to increase, but much more gradually than if the tourist ban was lifted completely. And that may actually be a good thing because it would give Cuba time to expand its absorption capacity in terms of those tourists.
Wait, how many people here are working with licensed providers? John is one, you're working with the nations and...
The nation.
Mauricio, you need to clarify it. Licensed doesn't exist anymore. Any organization has a general license to organize travel to Cuba. Any freaking organization. It is no longer licensed by OFAC. It's a general license, no application, no report. OFAC's put out a whole lot of nonsense about what you're supposed to do under it, but it has no control to enforce that. Nobody has to apply, nobody has to report. Only thing people have to do is if they travel through the U.S. or they want to get insurance through the U.S., they have to check off a form saying how they're using it and implying that they're doing or agreeing that they're doing all these other things. But it's totally meaningless, and I think it's not what the White House intended. I think the White House did intend a general license for individuals on people-to-people, but they got sandbagged somewhere along the way.
John, are you doing well with your license?
Yeah, we don't need it. We're doing these Cuba cruise things now. We're driving, I'm sure, people in OFAC crazy, just like we're driving Havana Tour crazy, because we're putting people on the Canadian-Cuba cruise under our general license. What Mark Wells said at the New York Times travel show, the burden of proof is on OFAC. It's just flipped over. OFAC would have to come after us. It'd have to come after any other organization that believes in its soul that it's doing a legitimate people-to-people trip. And it would have to take people to court and somehow prove that what you were doing was not people to
Right.
people.
Shall we take 3 more questions? Yes, you had your hand up.
I'm just curious to find out, is China's economic activities in the region a factor at all in how U.S. is trying to re-engage Latin America?
Right, that's one question. Did you understand that question? Yes, good. Yes, you had your hand up before.
Yeah, so since you guys travel a lot to Cuba and get to interact a lot with people, I wanted to know what you saw the reaction was to the policy change. But not only that, like, do you see this policy change as an attempt by Castro to maybe, I don't know, like a political strategy to like assure his re-election again in 2018? Given that, like, not his re-election, sorry, it's kind of like somebody who he assigns, but the reason I ask is because I know, like, the topic is a little taboo in Havana to talk about politics.
Well, this will be the last round of questions, so this is your last chance. This is one question, you have your hand up.
Can you explore what would be the impact of all this in the dissident community in Cuba?
Impact on dissident community in Cuba. You already asked a question. What?
Posada Carriles, I want to know what you think about it.
Posada Carriles, what do we think? What do we think of Posada Carriles? Anybody?
We don't like him.
What do you think about Diaz-Canal?
About the credit card situation.
Credit card.
Is that in one of these rounds? Is that something very imminent to happen?
That's easy to answer. Let's wait. Any other questions? That'll be it. So yes.
Large American corporations, tourist venues like Club Med and Donald Trump and all those. Is there any indication that they're trying to make any kind of like pre-inroads?
By the way, before we get to the replies, let me announce that the Summit of the Americas is on April 10th.
In Panama City.
On the 13th, we will have the third Bildner US-Cuba normalization process run of discussions like this. You're all invited. Peter, you're also invited. When will the paperback version come out? Soon?
The paperback version's coming out in late September.
Late September, so we'll wait until then. You're all invited, yes.
Political stability in Cuba. If Raul is going to step down in 2018, is there a obvious next in line? If there's a lot of political instability there, may that have an impact on this?
Will that have an impact on these conversations? Let's take those questions and then let's call it quits.
So let me just roll in there. There is no political instability in Cuba right now. One of the interesting phenomena that you haven't heard about is that these delegations, these high-level delegations that are going down, including the senators and the congressional delegations and some other delegations that you haven't heard about, have met with Diaz-Canal. They're not meeting with Raul Castro, who frankly is reserving his kind of hierarchy to meet with President Obama at this point. And everybody else is meeting with Diaz-Canal for the first time. They've not met with him before. And that is a clear signal that he is being positioned to succeed Raul Castro. There is no doubt that Raul Castro is stepping aside. I think in 2018 he's going to have turned, what, 87 by then?
He's 73 now.
He'll be 86, I believe. And he has made it clear that he's stepping aside. You know, there's lots of speculation among our circles about his children and whether Cuba really will go to a non-Castro leadership. But the fact that Diaz-Canal is meeting with people from the United States right now is a clear indication. I can tell you people coming away from those meetings feeling that he is very deeply involved and in charge of a lot of things going on in Cuba today.
So on the credit card, that's moving right along, and MasterCard has already indicated an interest. The key thing is going to be what businesses in Cuba will actually take U.S. credit cards, and that's going to be a while, I think, for that to work its way out. In terms of Club Med and places like that, U.S. businesses still cannot invest in Cuba. So that's going to be a while. That's going to require lifting the embargo before you're going to have U.S. travel industry being able to actually invest, much as they would like to. Impact on the dissident community. Well, I think the dissident community is divided about this. I mean, there are some dissidents who have always maintained that when U.S.-Cuban relations improve, political space expands on the island. And there are some dissidents who are rejectionists, if you will, and who think that the United States, by normalizing its relationship with Cuba, is not going to take the lead any longer in trying to overthrow this government, which they would like to see overthrown. So, the community is divided. I think what's actually more interesting is the way in which broader Cuban civil society is expanding and becoming more robust and becoming more outspoken. People who are not dissidents in the classic sense, but who are pushing the envelope of debate about what the future of the island should look like. And such as Cuba Posible, which are the people who used to run Espacio Laical, which was the church's magazine. Even people like Rafael Hernandez in the journal Temas, even though it's technically owned by the Ministry of Culture, nevertheless has been pushing the envelope in terms of debating things like racial inequality and socioeconomic inequality and poverty and so on, and what socialism and democracy in the future look like for Cuba.
Catholic Church?
Catholic Church is clearly the most important civil society institution on the island. It's the one that the government not only recognizes but respects, I think. Raul Castro, in his report to the 6th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party in 2011, publicly thanked the Catholic Church for the role that it was playing in assuring the unity of the Cuban nation going forward. Just really quite extraordinary for a country that before 1991 had atheism written into the Constitution. And then on the issue of China, I think China's interest in Cuba is fundamentally a commercial interest more than anything else. I think Cuba is happy to do business with China because it fits the model. That is to say, Cuban ministries can do business with sort of central authority in China and gets trade credits from state institutions in China. It's not nearly as messy as dealing with Canada, for example, where you have to deal with individual companies. And that's a complicated business. And the Cuban bureaucracy, frankly, is not well set up to do that. They're much more comfortable dealing with the old socialist model of how you handle international commercial relations. Did I miss one?
Yeah, you missed one?
Future instability in Cuba. No, I mean, as Peter said, Cuba is very stable. I think the one thing I would say, though, I think, is that at one point, Raul Castro said that the United States ought to normalize relations while Fidel was there because it would be harder when Fidel was gone. And I would just say it'll be harder when Raul is gone. So this process hasn't advanced further because even if Diaz-Canel becomes the president, as is in the line of succession, no one will have the authority of Fidel and Raul Castro as los históricos that led the revolution. And so the people who are doubters in the leadership about this normalization of relations they will have more space to obstruct it, I think, when that transition is made. So, the more progress that can be made in the next 3 years, the better.
Well, several Western Hemisphere countries appear in your accounts. Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Chile at one point, and the accounts that I read. Which one of those countries, if any, is likely to play, or which ones will play leading roles in the summit process, which I do agree with you, that will be very important?
all of the big countries are going to play a role. I think what's going to happen is that both President Obama and President Castro are going to come into a room full of regional leaders, and they're going to receive all sorts of kind of real and metaphoric applause for having gotten to this point. And all the countries are going to be trying to reinforce momentum to continue to go forward, and there'll be a lot of efforts. There's been countries involved in these recent talks. Canada hosted secret meetings.
18-month meetings.
Yep, and the Vatican played a role, and the president of Uruguay carried messages back and forth, and pressed Obama to trust, pressed Obama to move forward on letting the spies go, the Cuban agents go home, and pressed Raul Castro to actually take Obama seriously and accept his sincerity in wanting to move forward in US-Cuban relations. So
Pepe Mujica, right?
Pepe Mujica just stepped down from the presidency. So, you know, the regional kind of embrace, I think, is going to be strongly felt for both countries and both leaders when they're there. And you'll all be watching as the build-up to this takes place. There's going to be a lot of politics around it, a lot of photo ops. But what comes out of the summit in some ways will telegraph where we're going to go and how fast in the next 2 years.
We'll be discussing it here on the 13th. You're all welcome. Again, we will back channel to Cuba. Thank you. Thank you.